So, two systems. The state system, the federal system. At the heart of the federal system is the Supreme Court. When I say at the heart of the federal system, I should say that the only thing in the Constitution about the judicial system of the federal government, the only thing which is really mentioned and described is the Supreme Court. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So the Supreme Court is described in the Constitution, but the other federal courts are just mentioned. They can exist, but Congress creates them, something we discussed in the second lecture. And here you have a photograph of the 9 members of the Supreme Court. How is the federal system organized? As we've seen, the Constitution creates one Supreme Court. But Congress created a complete system, and we find again the same triangle which we found in the state judicial systems. 94 district courts. These are the federal courts to which you go if you have a complaint. Then appeal courts. Appeal courts re-examine cases which have been tried in district courts. You have 3 judges and they review decisions taken by district courts. And finally, on top of the system, one US Supreme Court, which is on top of the federal system, and we'll see that it's also on top of the state systems. State cases can go to the US Supreme Court eventually. Just to give you a rough idea of the numbers, 500,000 cases a year for the 94 district courts. So again, 5% of the total cases tried in the United States. And only 100 cases a year for the US Supreme Court. Yet, the US Supreme Court is the one playing the most prominent political role. 100 cases, which is a small number, but 100 important cases. What does the Supreme Court do? Well, first, it's a court of appeal. It's a court of appeal from federal courts, but also from state Supreme Courts. It means that if you are in Texas again, and you file a complaint, and it's examined in a Texas court, then a Texas appeal court, then at the level of the Texas Supreme Court. And if you're still dissatisfied, you can appeal to the US Supreme Court. So that's the last level, the court of last resort, the last court of appeal. And it's almost the same in the federal system. So if you go to the federal system, you can go into district court, then to circuit court, court of appeal, and if you're still dissatisfied, you can appeal to the US Supreme Court. And in some specific cases, the US Supreme Court has direct jurisdiction. Basically, it has to do with the relationships between a state and the federal government. But that's very marginal. 100 cases in more than 2 centuries. That's what the Supreme Court does. A court of appeal, reviewing the decisions taken by lower courts, but also an essential part of the US government. So far, we've seen that it's a body of justice. It just functions as a court of justice. That's not very political. We'll see how it works. Let's have a look first at the people working in the Supreme Court. You have all their names. This is a current Supreme Court, headed by Chief Justice Roberts in the center of the picture. 9 members in the Supreme Court, always 9 members. A Chief Justice, Roberts, and 8 associate justices. So the judges are called justices. There's something particular about the Supreme Court. Something surprising, maybe, in a political system. Its members are named for life. That it does not mean they have to die on the Supreme Court. It means that they can serve on the Supreme Court for as long as they want, until they die, retire, or resign, or they can be impeached in certain cases. That means that justices, who tend to be pretty old when they're nominated, serve on the court for 15 years on average. Remember that you can only be a president for 8 years. Remember that a senator is elected for 6 years and a member of a representative for 2 years. Justices serve for 15 years on average. They could serve, theoretically, for much longer. Meaning that judges on the Supreme Court have a long-lasting influence. Why would you choose to have people serve on the Supreme Court for life? The reason is simple. You want them to be independent. It is the higher office to which you can aspire if you're a judge in the United States. You cannot wish for anything more. In other words, you have nothing to gain by taking certain decisions. You cannot be bought, you cannot be bribed, you cannot be influenced, because no one can offer you anything better. You are independent. And because a president cannot remove a judge, the judges are also politically independent, in theory at least. In theory, because the president chooses the member of the Supreme Court. When a member retires, when a member dies, when a member leaves a vacancy in the court, well, the president gets to choose a replacement. And it's an opportunity for a huge political battle. Here you have a cartoon with a member of the Republican Party saying, all I need to know about the nominee, the president's nominee to the Supreme Court, is how to spell her name. Kip blah 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 of the Supreme Court. They're ready for a fight. And what happens is this. The president picks a replacement and the Senate confirms the nomination. And usually there is a huge fight because each party will try to find someone who will defend their views. But because of the system of checks and balances, the most unacceptable candidates are usually not accepted. There's a long process to check that the candidates are acceptable, and if they have been too political, if they have made radical statements, you can be sure that they will not be on the Supreme Court. So it's a political battle when the judges are nominated. They are political nominations, but you usually do not get extremists. Still, of course, presidents choose judges who share their ideas. And that means that there's a gross inequality between presidents. Ronald Reagan, in 2 terms, got to choose 4 judges. Clinton, in 2 terms, got to choose only 2 judges, meaning Ronald Reagan had a much deeper impact on the composition of the Supreme Court than Bill Clinton. And yet they both served for 8 years. So inequality. And right now, the effect of these political nominations is felt with the current Supreme Court led by John Roberts, who is a very conservative Chief Justice. And it's a very conservative Supreme Court because the majority of its members were chosen by Republican presidents, conservative presidents. Just an example, Sonia Sotomayor, chosen in 2009 by Barack Obama. She was a judge at the US Court of Appeal, and when she went to the Senate for confirmation hearings, she was asked about abortion, about gun control, about all the left-wing positions she had taken before her nomination. Everything which was seen as political was the point of debate. So she was a controversial candidate. She was called a liberal activist by some. Yet, the Senate voted 68-31 in her favor. Republicans voted for her, even though she was clearly on the left. She was on the left because she was chosen by Barack Obama, but she was acceptable. She was she could justify her decisions. She respected the Constitution. I'll put a link on eCampus for you to watch this video of her nomination confirmation hearings in the Senate. So now you know who the members of the Supreme Court are. Now, how does it work? The Supreme Court has a privilege. Unlike other courts, it can choose to hear a case or not. People write to the Supreme Court, it's called a writ of certiorari, a written request. They write to the Supreme Court to ask the Supreme Court to review their case, to hear their case. Each party comes to the Supreme Court and speaks to the justices, present the case. Then there's a question time, discussion with the 9 judges, and these are lively discussions. The judges will ask questions, try to understand the point of view of the people in front of them. Then the Supreme Court takes time to reflect, to debate between themselves, and produce a result, a judgment, with a vote. And it produces a majority opinion, the opinion of the majority, the judgment, plus a minority opinion. The judges who did not agree with the decision explain why they did not agree, on what ground they disagreed with that decision.